Okay, folks, if you are assembled and settled down with your lunch, I think we'll start in the interest of time. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon on this frosty day. My name is Mus Chishti. I direct Migration Policy Institute's office here at NYU School of Law. And we are here to talk about immigration policy, law, and politics. If you've noticed, immigration has been a lot in the news lately. And I think the shutdown and the pain that people experience sort of brought forth once again the centrality of immigration to this presidency. I think we always say that this is a historic moment in immigration. We had never seen this before, but I think we have to concede that this certainly is an unprecedented moment in immigration history in the US. We have never had in our history a person who made immigration an important theme of his campaign. He truly believes that he won the presidency because of his position on immigration. And unlike many other politicians, he kept his promise on delivering what he had promised in the campaign on immigration. This is exactly to remind us all, this week was the second anniversary of the famous travel bans, which were the first executive orders that the president issued. Since then, we know the administration has been active, especially on interior enforcement, especially at reforming asylum rules at the border, and in dealing with issues of citizenship in the US Census. So there's no issue where immigration is not getting touched in this presidency. And the shutdown, I think, in many ways, was just the culmination of what this presidency has made immigration to be. So if you are a law student interested even marginally in immigration, this is a great time to be at a law school. So for us to help analyze this moment in immigration history, we have gathered three of, I think, the country's best experts who have studied this phenomenon from legislative side, from the executive side, and in the academic world, probably more than anyone else. We're really fortunate that all of them came to the law school today. You all have their bios. Let me just briefly tell you who they are. Ur Jadoo is on my extreme left. Ur has a unique position. She was the chief counsel of the Immigration and Border Security in 2007 to 2010 when Democrats were in control of the House. On my extreme left is Cecilia Wong, who is the deputy legal director of the ACLU, has been at the center of all the litigation that ACLU has brought against the administration, argued most recently a very important case on mandatory detention. And lastly, but most importantly, is my colleague Nancy Morowitz, who has been for years advising congressional committees and advisory bodies on various aspects of immigration and help generate generations of law students who have become young lawyers and joined this field in various capacities. So, we at a law school setting would obviously like to sort of talk about in analytical, conceptual, theoretical terms, but we can't obviously ignore the elephant in the room, which is the wall. So I'm going to start by asking all our panelists this sort of basic question. So how did we get to this moment? Why did wall become such an important thing for this president? Why did it become so important for the Democrats to resist him, both as a moral issue and as a political and policy issue? And now that the president has essentially given 3 weeks of lease on this issue, which will end on February 15th, where do you think we will be back on February 15th? We can all, this is looking into gaze in the crystal ball, but do the best you can, starting with you.
Thank you. So before we talk about what is happening now and what may happen in just a couple of weeks, I think we need to go back a little bit. Let's remember where the concept of the border wall, build the wall, came from. There have been wide reports about this being a mnemonic device for candidate Trump, starting in 2014, to be disciplined about talking tough on immigration. And there was born Build the Wall. So we spent a campaign with that. But even after the president became president, he made this an issue, but it really wasn't what it is now. If you take a look back at even his budget proposals for fiscal year 18, for border wall fencing, he was merely asking $2.6 billion. In 2018, the budget request that his administration sent up to Congress, the request, that was $1.6 billion. So nothing like the $5 billion, $5.7 billion, the big numbers, even $25 billion you sometimes hear about, that we hear today or have been hearing for about a month and a half. And then when you even get to what Congress, under a Republican-controlled Congress, completely on the House and the Senate side, actually appropriated, so fiscal year 2018, it was only $1.6 billion. And it wasn't even necessarily border wall fencing. It was new border wall fencing. It was to replace certain places along the existing fencing, or new double fencing around those areas. So nothing like we're hearing about now. Fiscal year 2019, proposed bills, same thing. House-controlled, the House-controlled budget process in the House wasn't very much either. That Republican bill had $1.6 billion proposed. And then the same thing in the Senate, very small numbers, and there was supposedly an agreement. But again, these were not, nobody was talking about it in the terms that are being discussed today. So why are we here? Well, I'd like to think, and I'm not a political scientist, we should have probably asked someone from that department to be here. But I think the elections really made a big difference. And I do think that this president has not seen that difference that it should be making in his calculations. And I do believe that the Republicans have been going along with that perspective and have failed to recognize the power of 41 seats being flipped and the popular vote being higher than it's ever been for the Democrats since Watergate. That was a big deal. So the more and more the president talked about his border wall, the more and more the other side became very serious about it. There was this newly empowered Congress with 41 seats and this incredible, powerful vote that came from those elections. And if you even go back and look at what happened just a week after the election, nobody recognized how big of a wave it was. It wasn't until well into 3-4 weeks later when it was very clear that it wasn't just 25, 30 seats, it was 41 seats with a large vote. So the president has been miscalculating. The Democrats are realizing the more he talks about it, the more concerning it became. They dug into it as well. And we ended up with a shutdown in which the president refused to even negotiate. The supposed compromise was nowhere near what I don't even think was an attempt at a compromise when you take a look at the details. There were so many poison pills in there, and they knew that. They clearly knew exactly what those provisions would be that would ultimately not be able to move in this new Congress. So where do we go from here? That's a good question. It's very unclear. They are going to be officially meeting in a conference committee between the Senate and the House to talk about where to begin. It's clear at the moment that there is no clear path forward. That's what the discussions are going to be. There is some hope. At the same time, we may end up where we were with the president who continues to say, well, I still believe in my border wall, although he has made some attempts for the last month to say that he can declare a national emergency, build his wall anyway, regardless of what Congress does. So we'll see. I think I wouldn't want to predict because I'm not really sure what could happen even tomorrow based upon what I'm reading today. Sadly, things are a little bit different now when you have a wild card.
Great. Nancy? Same question.
So I think a lot of what Ur said is completely right about how this idea of the wall came up. But what I guess I'm interested most of all is what's going to happen in the next 3 weeks. What the discourse about wall and border security money might mean in terms of where this conference committee will come out and what else might happen during the next couple of years. I mean, if you listen to the debate over the last couple of weeks around the shutdown, a lot of it was about, well, should there be a shutdown or shouldn't there be a shutdown? But in terms of the wall, a lot of the discourse one heard from some Democrats was, well, should it be a wall or should it be border security? Should it be smart border security, better border security? And I think there is not any real interrogation of the question of, like, how much money is there already for border security? Do we really need more money? Should there actually be less money being given to this agency? The budget of the Department of Homeland Security has grown exponentially over the last 2 decades. And what that means for communities who live on the border is, you know, when money isn't going into walls, but is going into, for example, Border Patrol officers, those Border Patrol officers are literally boarding buses and trains and taking people off and interrogating them about their status, many of whom have a right to be in this country. But, you know, like our clinic did a study of this a number of years ago when it was a problem, and then it subsided, and now it's a problem again. So there's no real look at, is there already too much money in this budget given the ways it's used and what it means for communities that live along the border. And, you know, instead it's a political concept. It's a political concept that's been introduced as a way to create leverage in negotiations. And so the first question is, do you actually need more money in this budget, whatever it's being used for, or is the budget too high to begin with? And then the second question is, well, when people start debating this, there's this question, well, what else could we agree on? And to some extent, those are budgetary questions. Is it, you know, more Border Patrol officers? Is it more technology? Is it more immigration judges and so on? Is it money to actually create a physical barrier? You know, but sometimes other things wind up getting into these bills, and we've seen this many, many times over the years. I mean, in particular, you know, back in 1996, when the current immigration laws came into effect, a lot of things happened at the last minute in conference committees. And I know that when I work on issues, almost every issue I work on has to do with some provision that came up in a conference committee, and nobody really studied it, nobody really asked how much sense it makes. And so I understand this conference committee process has to happen. It has to happen particularly because nobody wants the government to shut down again. I mean, that was a horrible thing to have happen. But as an immigration advocate and as an observer of what's been happening, I worry about little provisions that get snuck in that seem uncontroversial, but where the legislators who were in that conference committee don't really understand the lived impact on the ground for people if those provisions go through.
Cecilia, you want to?
Sure.
Same question.
So Musi asked 2 questions that I think are very different and that are interesting in juxtaposition. One is, how did we end up here talking about the wall? And the second is, why are the Democrats in Congress now so concerned about stopping it? I mean, what is the wall? It's literally and physically a symbol. It's a symbol of Trump's immigration agenda, which is primarily a xenophobic agenda, and that was about restoring a pre-civil rights era vision of U.S. immigration policy. And so in that sense, it's a symbol of his Muslim ban, of family separation, of the multi-pronged attack on asylum rights in the United States, on the termination of DACA, for example. And so the same thing we've seen, I think, with the wall is what we've seen with all those other things, which is that Trump policies as a whole and each individually represent an enormous backslide in the progress that as a movement we've been trying to make toward reforming a 230-year history of xenophobia in U.S. immigration law. But the Trump administration policies on immigration are also a silver lining, because in the extreme nature of those policies is a seed of resistance to those policies on the part of people who might otherwise not care about immigration. And so I think in that sense, the wall as a symbol, as a physical manifestation of Trump's immigration policies is an opportunity. And I agree with Nancy that the big question is what next? Democrats in Congress and previous Democratic administrations have been as ready to jump in and have more and more enforcement beyond any rational limit for political purposes. We saw that in 1996, as Nancy said, with mass detention of people fighting deportation cases, an effort to strip the federal courts of review of these administrative deportation orders, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think the big question is, as the Democrats begin to resist because Trump takes things so far, and because the Trump administration now has this constitutional showdown between the legislative branch and the executive branch, and because there are structural issues at play and partisan issues at play, I think the big question for all of us who actually are part of immigrant communities or fighting alongside immigrant communities and on behalf of immigrant communities, the question is, will the Democrats hold firm? And not, once again, as President Obama said, buy into the framework of get right with the law first and lock down the border, and then we'll see about a path to citizenship. So I do think that's the key question here.
Great. So just opening this up a little. So we now know that, talking about resistance, that there are essentially three fronts of resistance emerging to this administration. One is on the congressional front, one is in the courts, and frankly, the third one, important, less noticed, is from the states. So let's examine each one of them in blocks. So first, tell us, as the master of the house, give students an idea of what does it mean for the House to change hands? How big that deal is?
Sure.
And how does it we know that when Pelosi became Speaker, suddenly she could tell the president, you're not invited to the House. I mean, that's symbolically how it is. But using immigration as an example, how does the change in the leadership of the House manifest itself?
In many ways, in many important ways. Number one, the majority party in the House controls 2/3 of the budget. So the minority, which was the Democrats in the last few years, only had 1/3 of the budget. That means committees and committee staff, if you are in the majority party, all of a sudden you have 2/3 of the budget, you get the bigger office, everybody's moving around now, they're getting more resources. The immigration subcommittee, for example, in the House is going from 2 counsel to 5. That's a big difference. What does that mean? 3 more people working 70 hours a week or more, watching and thinking and trying to figure out how to conduct proper oversight. The chairman of each committee control exactly what goes on, what hearing topics there will be. The chairman controls the subpoena power, and the chairman of the Rules Committee, which is in close contact with the Speaker, decides which bills go to the House floor. So just because a member of Congress introduces a bill doesn't mean that bill gets any time on the House floor or any time in committee. It is up to the chairman of those committees and the Speaker and the Rules Committee to decide which bills go to the floor. And who's that controlled by? The majority party. That matters. Then, of course, you have majorities, which mean legislatively. You have more votes. This means you could probably get bills through. Of course, let's assume, though, that the Senate, being with different control, it has to get through there. The House is only 1/2 of the Congress. But that is an important mechanism to push the Senate into activity on certain issues. So those are just three of the main points, and I can go into detail about what oversight means, but it is so much. When I mention the subpoena power and the staffing, there is so much that a staff member on a committee can do. And I very clearly remember this, picking up the phone and saying, DHS, I want you to come over and explain this policy to me. Bring your head of the office that controls this policy or the implementation of it. I want them to come talk to me. I have questions. They abide. They come over. You talk about it. That's pressure. That's leverage. Then the member could do the same. That's all behind the scenes. Let's add the public element to it. When things don't go as one wishes behind the scenes, you publicly bring the people forward. If they're not paying attention and they don't want to answer to those requests, there is ultimately the subpoena power, but there's also the appropriations process, which again, the majority controls that bill. So if an agency refuses to act, there may be repercussions as to the budget, or they may require in the law that the agency come up and report to them in certain ways or do things in certain ways. There are all sorts of levers of power when you're in the majority that clearly do not exist when you're in the minority.
But if you follow up, just to complete this round, if you had to tell us what are the likely topics of oversight in the short term, midterm, and what are the likely topics for legislation, just to
Sure.
tick mark them?
So it's already begun. Just yesterday, the House Armed Services Committee, an unlikely committee for immigration, but as we all know, with the military sitting at our border now, even the Armed Services Committee has stepped in. They had a hearing, and it was run by the chairman who was not happy about the military being sent to the border and had a lot of questions for the Department of Defense. So that is actually the first hearing on these very issues. We were hoping and expecting a Homeland Security Committee meeting with Secretary Nielsen, Homeland Security Secretary Nielsen, just next week. And the questions that were going to be thrown at her were everywhere. Everybody was preparing for all the questions on family separation, including obtaining documents that so many people through litigation, through the courts, have been trying to get. And ideally, through a very public hearing, you put even more pressure on them to deliver documents that we've all been hoping to see. From family separation to the detention issues, certainly the Homeland Security Committee, the Judiciary Committee, and other unlikely committees that normally would have never touched immigration are now having to touch it because it's falling squarely within their jurisdiction. So you normally didn't hear about the House Energy and Commerce Committee worried about immigration, but they have jurisdiction over the children at the Health and Human Services, under Health and Human Services federal custody that were separated from children or who come alone. And all of a sudden that has become a big issue for them, other than just basic oversight. The oversight, the House Oversight Committee, which has jurisdiction of all of the government to conduct oversight where there is some sort of waste, fraud, and abuse, they certainly are looking into many aspects of immigration because there is a lot of waste, fraud, and abuse coming out of all parts of our immigration components. You'll definitely, through the appropriations process, there's a large appropriations committee with several subcommittees who each want to look into these very issues. And even if they don't have very public hearings, they need to ensure that the money that they are appropriating is being used appropriately or not, and determining what they need to do in the next appropriation bill, which, as we all know, has to pass. Some version of it has to move every single year to keep the government open. And that's exactly what we're going through now.
Great, Cecilia, so as the chief opponent of the president in the courts, the resistance...
There are many of those.
As the resistance from the courts, so what are the present battles in the litigation world against the Trump agenda?
There are many of those, too. Of course, we started with the Muslim ban. We then had the termination of DACA, which has been fought by Make the Road New York, here in town, and many others, the Yale Clinic, NILC. We've had many litigation battles over the attacks of the administration on asylum seekers. So there were several big cases and many small cases on that. One is the proclamation that Trump issued relatively recently to try to channel all asylum claims through ports of entry, completely contrary to U.S. law and international law. There's former Attorney General Sessions' unilateral decision in his AB opinion to interfere with the ways that asylum law has developed on asylum based on gender related claims of abuse and persecution and gang affiliation or gang persecution claims. And there's, of course, been the litigation over family separation, and there's been litigation, it should be noted, against the something that has been pinned on Trump, which is the vast increase in detention of asylum seekers, which is actually something we started noticing during the Obama administration. But all of that litigation has been very fruitful. Even the Muslim ban litigation, of course, which infamously ended up being unsuccessful in the Supreme Court. And I think, related to your last question, what's also interesting is the role of states and municipalities in the resistance in the courts, with California and New York and various municipalities, Philadelphia, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Santa Clara County, all fighting back against Trump's anti-sanctuary policy and his executive order issued on his third day in office. And so you see an interesting kind of constellation of litigants and counsel out there, again, resisting policies of this administration.
So Nancy, as Cecilia began to point out, there's a huge development of resistance at the state. Could you just quickly tell us what that landscape is looking like?
Yeah, so there's an enormous amount states can do to be friendly to their immigrant populations and to their families with immigrant members in them. Many states have passed laws that allow driver's licenses for people regardless of immigration status, often seen as an issue both of people's ability to get to work and to do other things like that, but also as a safety issue in the states. There's been an enormous move also around tuition and both the in-state tuition policies allowing undocumented students who've grown up in a state, gone to school in a state, to then get into in-state tuition, which, as everybody who's ever paid a tuition bill knows, it makes a huge difference. And then also to have access to state assistance for tuition. So those are probably the two things that have been the most commonly done. Some localities have been very involved. States are involved in some of this litigation, but localities have been involved in pushing back against detainer laws that are detainer practices. So detainers are like somebody gets arrested, and before they even go to court and maybe get their case dismissed or anything, their name is handed over to immigration, and immigration puts a detainer on them and asks the locality to hold that person in jail, not to release them so that they can go straight into immigration detention. That used to be a very, very common thing here in New York. New York City has passed 2 laws that have made that restricted. It should, as far as I'm concerned, they shouldn't be honoring detainers at all, but they're very limited now in New York. There's similar laws in other places, and then there's also been litigation against the government, the federal government, on the use of detainers. Basically, the issue there is that the federal government doesn't really have authority to hold people, to arrest people for their civil immigration violation just because they right now are dealing with a criminal case which might actually get dismissed. And so many courts have said it's illegal to be holding people on these detainers, and some localities are pushing back on that. But there are much more ambitious ideas of what states can do in New York. There was a piece of legislation called the New York is Home Act that was looking to do a whole range of different things for non-citizens, including allowing people to be recognized as New York State citizens, even if they aren't federal citizens. So there are lots of things that can happen at the state and local level if states and localities are really interested in doing that. But I want to circle back a little bit more to the oversight question, because, you know, for years there really hasn't been the possibility of having things really happening in Congress that would be pro-immigrant, just simply because of who was holding power in the House. But there are so many things on which there could be oversight, you know, particularly if you look at detention, this very, very bloated system that detains people largely for no reason, you know, often setting very, very high bonds that people can't afford to pay, and then when they can't afford to pay those bonds, you know, even if they could ultimately win their case and stay in the country, they can't afford to pay their bond, so they stay in jail, so they're not working, so then their family doesn't have the income to pay the rent or pay the mortgage, and so people are getting evicted. Literally, kids are being placed in foster care. I mean, there are like a whole lot of questions about the detention system that could be the subject of real congressional oversight, not to mention some of the other questions. I mean, everybody knows about family separation and what a travesty that was, but, you know, the health questions. I mean, the people who are getting really terrible health care because they are in detention, you know, whose lives are at risk and whose lives in some cases are lost because they are in detention. So that's one of the things that there could be oversight on. There could be oversight on, also related to detention, the sort of sweetheart relationship with the private prison industry. The private prison industry has lost ground on the criminal side, and so they're sort of trying to make up their interest by housing immigrants. And so it's a very lucrative thing, and those companies' stocks have been responding to the change of the political winds. And yet, what are those relationships? How are they working? How are they charging? Like, all of those kinds of questions. Just, you know, a lot of people in different advocacy organizations have done studies and reports on these sorts of things, but they're doing it from the outside, and they're doing it with limited information. Congress has amazing power, if it wants to use it, on that kind of oversight. And then Congress has power to go back and look at the laws, the sort of framework of laws under which people face arrest, detention, deportation, people who often have been legal residents of this country for a long time. They have the power to look at that and, as an affirmative agenda, you know, to sort of change those laws. And that's also something that could be done. You know, when those laws were first passed back in 1996, and some of the outrages came out in the press, the most pro-enforcement members of the House, people who are still there, who were the architects of the 1996 immigration laws, said, oh, we never meant them to be applied so harshly. We expected levels of discretion. That's what they said, and they said it in a letter that people signed, you know, from all sides of the aisle, you know, from far to one side, far to the other, and in the middle. And they sent that letter back in the 90s saying, we never really meant these laws to be applied to the limit. Well, right now we have an administration that said, well, we have the power to apply them to the limit, and we think we should apply them to the limit. Well, what that means is that Congress needs to go back and revisit some of those laws. So there's a lot that could be on the agenda.
Great. So just on the states and localities, I just want to make one point about the importance of the change in the detainer policies. I mean, I think our own MPI's study looked at this intersection between criminal justice system and immigration, and I think counterintuitively concluded that despite all the narrative of the Trump administration, they probably will never be able to remove the same number of people as was done during the end of the Bush and in the beginning of the Obama administration, just because of the change in the detainer policies in many states and cities. So just to keep that in the back of our mind about how important the role of states in this debate. New York State just passed the DREAM Act, which Nancy tangentially mentioned, only because New York State suddenly had a change in its Senate, where the Republican stronghold in the Senate was no longer possible and things became more and more possible in a different direction. Let me shift gears and do this more theoretical little bit of analysis in a law school kind of setting. It's just taking DACA as the example, and all of you know what DACA is. DACA is the acronym for the program that President Obama introduced, under which Dream kids cannot be deported and they get work authorization. This was one of the examples where we learned the importance of president's authority. And we also by now learned president has a lot of authority on immigration. And DACA, Obama passed it and Trump ended it. So we know there's a lot of authority there. But we have also noticed that there is much more of an interesting dynamic and interplay between the executive and the legislative branch and the courts on issues of immigration in some unusual and unprecedented ways. So picking DACA as the case of that. So Cecilia, just start with us. What did the Supreme Court do last week on DACA?
The question is, what did the Supreme Court not do? Right? So there were a number of lawsuits filed about President Trump's termination of the DACA program and other lawsuits about DACA. And there were 3 injunctions that issued on behalf that benefited people who already had a grant of DACA and were therefore at least theoretically able to renew their DACA. And so these 3 injunctions issued in Northern California, in the Eastern District of New York, and in the DC District Court. And the government filed cert petitions, some of them cert before judgment. Actually, they probably all were filed before judgment, though the Ninth Circuit has ruled now. And so the case was sitting there on the government cert petition and was relisted twice. And everybody was on tenterhooks, waiting to see, is the Supreme Court going to take these cases and potentially reverse the injunctions, and therefore letting Trump go ahead and terminate DACA. Well, the Supreme Court did not act. The Supreme Court did not take cert, didn't do anything with it, which means at least it's too late for the rest of this Supreme Court term ending in June for the Supreme Court to take action. So DACA lives at least until the end of the term and through the summer. So we're talking actually, or panelists here were talking at lunch about speculating about what might be behind that non-action by the Supreme Court. And of course, none of us knows, but it is interesting that Trump was so publicly saying that he was relying on the Supreme Court to vindicate him as he was embroiled in this showdown with Congress over the shutdown, right? And Trump was tweeting out like the Supreme Court's going to take that off the table anyway, take DACA off the table anyway. So there are all kinds of theories about whether Chief Justice Roberts might have been wanting to preserve some of the credibility of the court and keep the court out of this political battle. But we can all
Nancy,
speculate.
you thought about this in
So-
very sophisticated ways. So what dance is going on?
Well, I'm not sure that's true. But I'm not sure that we're sort of totally out of the woods on this.
Sure.
So the Supreme Court, they have conferences to decide whether or not to take a case, and they list cases for each conference. The DACA cases were listed twice, and usually if something's listed twice, then that means they're not going to take it. But this term, they did take a case that was listed 4 times. So it is possible that they just right now don't want to act quite yet in the middle of this showdown in these 3 weeks. There's certainly been talk that DACA might be on the table as something that would be in play in these 3 weeks. I don't know that that's actually going to happen, but the Supreme Court might be concerned about it. Now, there also is the timing question, which Cecilia brought up, which is that the Supreme Court, unlike virtually every other institute, well, I don't know, maybe there are other Congresses like this too, but, it works from October till the end of June, and that's it, and so they...
What other institutions are like that? Law schools?
So they, good point. So not the clinics, I'll say that. So ordinarily, they do not take a case after the end of January that they're going to decide by June. But we know right now, for example, I mean, they have sort of on their docket this citizenship question on the census issue, which they've taken off the calendar and the government wants them to put it back on the calendar. And if they do that, it will be on a new issue that they haven't seen yet. But, you know, I think that the government could be making a push at some point for them to look again at the DACA cases. You know, I don't know that they're going to do that. I think it's probably most likely that they wouldn't. But if you think about the implications, I mean, if the Supreme Court had taken the DACA cases, or if it had stayed the injunctions, which is what, you know, of the lower courts, that would be a totally different situation for Congress right now, because it would be a crisis. It would be a total crisis about people with DACA, and that would completely change the dynamics in Congress. You know, I think similarly, there was a case in the fall, there are cases, ACLU cases, challenging the administration's policy saying that people can't get asylum if they don't appear at a port of entry, and this is coupled with policies that say we're not going to let you in at a port of entry. But in any event, the part of it that says you can't seek asylum if you're not at a port of entry were challenged immediately in district court, and there are injunctions. And the Solicitor General's office went from the district court, and this has become more and more common that they go straight to the Supreme Court and said, please stay these injunctions while we follow the appellate process, because it's a very important issue. And usually, when the Solicitor General asks for something from the Supreme Court, they have a very good chance of getting it. And the court denied that stay. There were 4 dissenters, and I'll leave it to your imagination who the dissenters were. But they did not stay that injunction. And so if they had stayed that injunction, that would be an immediate political issue for Congress. And so you know, it is really a study in the operation of the 3 branches more than I can imagine in recent history of the executive taking some action, the courts stepping in, what the courts do affecting what Congress does, and all of this sort of working out differently in different contexts.
And I should have said, the government also asked for a stay of the Northern California injunction on DACA, both from the Ninth Circuit and the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court denied that stay as well. So interesting, very interesting.
So over to you on Congress. So this, I mean, I've looked at DACA as an example where all 3 branches of the government have essentially pushed the can as far down as they can. But this is the time when the can has to stop somewhere. So if the Supreme Court finally, whether it's before June or in October, says that Trump was right in ending DACA, what pressure does that put on the Congress to act on it, and do you think they will?
Well, I think Nancy stated, it would be a crisis. You're looking at 700,000 people with a current status, ability to stay in the United States to work, all of a sudden losing that and being threatened with removal. So the Congress has, even without an imminent end to DACA, has been very concerned. If there is an imminent end, and as people's status and their work authorization come to an end, the crisis would be growing by the day. So Congress would feel incredible pressure to act, which has, in a certain sense, a perverse effect on the Congress to act now and quickly if that happens, when it should actually act before that happens. Unfortunately, Congress tends, if you take a look at many moments through successful legislative action that actually makes it through enactment, it's often because of some kind of deadline, something that is pushing them to act immediately. So I do believe that something would happen. Now the problem is, what is that? That is not the easy question to answer. It is also worrisome for, I think, all of us up here. It would not be like Congress says, oh, there's an emergency, we have to help all of these people. Why would the situation change where we currently have an administration and a president who ended the program. They don't agree with it. They ended TPS. They've created a situation at the border. Some say manufactured a crisis at the border. And all of a sudden, they would pass a clean DREAM Act that would provide permanent solutions for 700,000 people. That's probably unlikely. And so what would it take then to arrive at a solution when we are faced with a crisis? And I think that's what the president was often alluding to when he kept saying, well, I'm going to be vindicated by the court, and then the Democrats will come to me and ask me to pass a DACA. And then he was going to feel empowered to get all the things that he repeatedly has asked for from the Congress. And what are those things? Let's go back to a previous time where we all thought there was going to be a dream package deal where the trade-off was going to be $25 billion in some kind of border security, including border wall money. And then that fell apart. And that fell apart because of the president. Then came, what were the things that he was asking for? Some very drastic changes to our legal immigration system, completely rewriting the rules on family preference, our family preference system in the immigration system, getting rid of the diversity lottery, and a whole lot of other pieces to this. Recently, that compromise that he talked about, gosh, it hasn't even been that long, but it feels like so long ago. That included a series of what I would call poison pills, including requiring the return of Central American children without appropriate checks to ensure they're not going back to unsafe situations, requiring that any child from Central America seeking asylum do it in country or in region, and having no ability to come to the border to seek asylum. And those were the ones that were out there. But let's think about what else has been asked for in the past. An end to Flores, which protects children from terrible conditions in detention and from
Can you tell
prolonged.
people what the Flores settlement is?
So the Flores settlement agreement is a over 20-year-old agreement between the former INS, the government, and the plaintiffs regarding children who were left in detention for a very, very long time in horrible conditions. And the idea here was that we need to keep children out of this horrible situation. So over many years of litigation, I think it was over a decade, eventually the government and the plaintiffs agreed upon what they would do, and that's called the Flores Settlement Agreement. And the basic parameters are, there are some basic standards. If a child is in detention, there are some certain standards that a child, that have to be protected for the conditions of the child's detention. But more importantly, the child cannot remain in detention in a prolonged or indefinite manner. So the current standard is 20 days, but that was something that definitely came out through the family separation crisis. And if you think about it, that's another perfect example of the interaction between the three branches of government. At the time the family separation crisis was happening, the president kept saying, Congress, it's your fault, specifically the Democrats. It's the Democrat law, he would say. I think that's how he put it, the Democrat law that created this situation. You need to change it. And certainly there were some efforts in Congress to try to come up with a solution. At the same time, the administration was trying to go back into the court to try to amend the Flores Agreement, and that was unsuccessful. On top of that, the executive branch recently proposed a regulation to essentially end Flores. They say they're not doing that, but it is an amendment, but an actual complete change of the Flores Agreement. So a lot of different moving parts, all mixed between the branches of government. So certainly, these are the issues we will face if we end up in a crisis where DACA needs to be enacted quickly. There will be some difficult decisions to make. There will be people trying to use that crisis to obtain provisions that otherwise would not normally achieve majority vote. I think there are a lot of provisions in there that most people would disagree with more generally, but when faced with a crisis, it could change things.
Okay, Cecilia, I can't resist asking you the question because there's a distinct possibility that on next 2 weeks, if the president doesn't get his wall or the Venetian blinds, that it may turn into by then.
Whatever you want to call it.
Whatever you want to call it. And he declares an emergency. Are you going to challenge it?
Unlike some of my colleagues, I don't like to announce those things publicly, but suffice to say that
We thought we were going to make some news. We're going to make some news here this afternoon.
Suffice to say that a lot of people are looking very carefully at litigation strategies in the event that the president declares a national emergency in order to fund the border wall. A lot would depend, what that litigation would look like depends a lot on the details, what legal basis he asserts, if any, what the mechanism is. There's been a lot of talk that he was discussing diverting Army Corps of Engineers projects away from, guess where, Puerto Rico, Northern California, his enemy places, to send the Army Corps of Engineers to the wall instead in order to participate in construction. There's discussion about building only on federal land. And so there are different theories about different plaintiffs, including the House of Representatives, who would have standing on various different theories depending on the authority that he asserts. So I think it's a safe bet that there will be litigation if the president declares an emergency. And the basic idea, I think, on whatever theory is the same, that there is in fact no emergency, especially since he himself has declared that he's going to declare the emergency if Congress doesn't give him what he wants, which doesn't really sound like an emergency. And that in fact there are many different legal theories, including constitutional challenges to the president's effort to circumvent the statutory grounds on which he can declare a national emergency.
So we may still have Pelosi v. Trump as a lawsuit. We'll open this for questions in about 4 minutes, but let me ask the final question again in the same spirit as before, just to create sense of balance in these panels and forums. Going back to Trump, a lot of people argue that there is some validity to Trump's point about immigration, that this is about rule of law, this is about immigration being out of control. How do you, from your 3 different perspectives, respond to that impulse? Nancy, why don't you start?
Well, it's a sort of odd place for somebody to be talking about the rule of law.
Law school, ultimately.
No, I don't mean here. I mean, you say that who you say is suggesting that we need the rule of law. I think, anyway, that's a side comment. I think that the rule of law is often used in a way that when people speak it, they say it as though the law is meant to be absolute and have no wiggle room about anything. So under like an absolutist view of the rule of law, every time you jaywalk, you should be arrested because it is, in fact, something that you can go to jail for 15 days for. And we live in a society in which that does not, in fact, happen. So with respect to immigration laws are full of contradictions. So just to give you an example, the very same person can be subject to arrest, detention, and deportation, and also be eligible for citizenship. That's the way the law is written. And so you could have an administration that would follow the rule of law and allow people to apply for citizenship and fairly seek to become full members of society, or could say, oh, you applied for citizenship, we're going to arrest you and detain you and put you in deportation proceedings. So I don't really know how you think about the rule of law with respect to those kinds of questions. I also think, in terms of the rule of law, you could think about, are the detention centers following the standards they're supposed to follow? You could be thinking about a lot of different things. And instead, the terminology is used only to speak about the idea of people being in the country currently without status. But many people who are in the country currently without status actually have a legal grounds to stay in the country. They often don't have lawyers to help them pursue those legal grounds, but they do have legal grounds. So if you really cared about the rule of law, you would be thinking about all of these things at the same time, as opposed to using it just as terminology to sort of support a particular agenda.
Great. Cecilia, what's your view on this?
You know, I think this is a really important question, and, you know, some people might be surprised to hear me say it as a litigator, but I think that over all the many years that all of us have been involved in immigration law and policy, there have been 3 myths that have persisted and that have actually become more prevalent. The first is that immigrants and immigration are bad for the economy and cause loss of jobs. This is old, you know, myth. The second is, and this is one that I think really has been actively fomented, something false that's been actively fomented by our opponents, and that is that being in the US without authorization is a crime in itself, and that immigrants are more likely to commit crimes than other people living in the US. And the third is that there's some line to get into if you want to immigrate to the United States, and that people who are here without status have cut into that line, right? And that is easily dispelled if you go to USCIS's website, or sorry, the State Department's website, and look at the length of the line, the waiting time for close family members of people from certain countries, right? And you see that for certain categories of relatives trying to get a green card to come to the US who are from Mexico, that they're getting to people who got in line in 1996 today, right? In China and Mexico, it's like 2005 or somewhere thereabouts, right? And that's a direct result of US immigration law and policy. So there is no line, effectively, for so many people. And I think the mistake that I worry that we are making as a movement right now is that there's a tendency now to label anyone who agrees with Trump's immigration policies or finds them interesting or positive, labeling those folks as white supremacists. And let me just be clear about one thing. I think the policies, the Trump administration policies, are rooted in white supremacy and blatant racism. The words they use to justify them are racist, right? But so I just want to be clear. What I'm saying is that it's a mistake, strategically a mistake, and factually a mistake, I think, to say everyone who agrees with these policies is a white supremacist. And we as a movement have not been able to figure out what to do. We first of all don't even understand the emotions behind the many people who tend to agree with Trump on immigration, much less understand how to deal with those emotions of fear, of alienation in their own country, right? And so I think that is a question we really have to answer as a movement, and we need to move forward, or we're going to keep backsliding. We haven't dealt with it.
Great. You thought about this a lot. You're a law enforcer, both in Congress and the administration, so.
Yeah, no, I have thought about it a lot because it has really irked me. At times I've gotten very angry at the way the term the rule of law is used, as if it doesn't have any meaning, or maybe they think it does when it's used. You heard it a lot from the previous Attorney General Sessions, who recently left. It's an overused term. I don't think that the people who use it understand it. If you look at actually the policies that came out from the former Attorney General, under the former Attorney General, and so far appear to be continuing under the current acting situation and likely a new Attorney General. I mean, just take a look at what zero tolerance was, which was at the heart of that family separation crisis. I think Nancy just talked about that. It's not black and white. The rule of law doesn't mean the law is applied in black and white terms. You jaywalked, therefore you must go to jail for 15 days. Everyone, I mean, all of New York would be, all of DC would be in jail. Let's just Think about that. So what ended up happening in that zero tolerance policy when they were advertising it as rule of law, this was a policy that was based in the rule of law, was a humanitarian crisis, that the American public threw up their arms and they were screaming about it, so much so that it was the one of the few times that the president actually backed down. So that's one example. At the immigration courts, same thing has happened. You had the Attorney General welcome a group of immigration judges with a welcoming, I shouldn't call it a welcoming speech, but his speech, this is how he started. Immigration judges conduct designated proceedings subject to such supervision and shall perform such duties as the Attorney General shall prescribe. Yes, he was citing the Immigration Nationality Act, but would you do that as the head of the Attorney General welcoming immigration judges who wear robes? We all understand that there was a history in which they weren't immigration judges who wear black robes and appear to be immigration judges with courtrooms that appear to suggest there is independence, but that is how he welcomed 44 new immigration judges. How would I feel? How would you feel if all of a sudden he's telling you all of these things to do and you're supposed to act like you're independent in your court? I know there was some mention about matter of AB and how one should be acting as a judge in determining whether someone should be granted asylum. He had some strong views in that opinion. They weren't lawful, he shouldn't have done what he did, but he certainly tried to strong-arm the judges into viewing the world in the way he did and granting or denying asylum in various situations. And there are so many other, I can just go through a series of things that he's done to the immigration courts, or he did, and that, I won't go through them here because we're running out of time, but I just, that is at the heart, and he was our Attorney General, and that is the Department of Justice that is supposed to be a place of justice, yet an overused term, rule of law.
Okay, so do justice to the question and answer hour. So the mics, if you want to ask a question, you should know you're going to get taped, but there are volunteers willing to bring the mic to you. Any volunteers?
Hi, thank you so much for coming to speak with us today. I was very interested in, early on you were discussing what a negotiation over a border wall would look like with Trump and how obviously he's taking a hard stance and like refusing to negotiate. But in some respect, honestly, we are too. The border wall is abhorrent to many of us and it is a symbol of hate. And it sounds like this is something we are not willing to give up. So if we're going to realistically talk about a negotiation with Trump, what would it look like? Are we trying to meet in the middle? Are we trying to get him to come over to our side of things? And if we are meeting in the middle, what are we giving up?
Or you want to do this?
For sure, and that's an interesting question. So if you listen to the president and the way he talks about the border wall, it's as if that is the end-all be-all to border security, that there is no other way to conduct border security. And he even claimed that if we have a border wall, we're going to cut crime, in half? Is that what he said? Something like that.
No, build the wall, crime will fall.
Yes, exactly. So there are experts, many of them, who say the border wall, in the way that he's envisioning, absolutely does not work. But you can differ on that. But he has, nowhere is he fighting for other things that actually do work and have been supported by both sides of the aisle. So that, I think, is what is so concerning, is if you really believe in border security and you really believe in stopping the drug traffic, where is your request to enforce the ports of entry, which is where 90-something% of the drugs actually come through? That's not going to happen with a border wall. What are you doing to insist upon new Customs and Border Protection officers there who can scan trucks for drugs and criminal things happening through those ports of entry. So this is where I think it's not a fair comparison to say that the Democrats are doing the same thing, because there is a reasonable approach to border security, but and I think the Democrats have for very long agreed with many of those ideas and supported many of them and actually advocated for many of them and may currently do so. But nowhere in his proposal is there that. It's all about the border wall, which makes you wonder, is it really about border security?
Either of you want to chime in on this?
Well, I mean, I feel that this is more of a political question, not something I have any expertise on, but it seems to me some deal is going to be reached. And, you know, it's hard to say what that deal is going to look like because, you know, I've focused on all the kinds of immigration provisions that I worry about coming in, but those are things that could come in. There are good things that could happen on immigration. Which right now seems less likely to happen in that process. You know, there's certainly been talk about things having to do with DACA and TPS. Personally, I don't think that's what's going to happen in this time frame, but that's possible. And then there's a lot of concern about just the whole phenomena of shutdowns and whether something can happen on that, which my guess is that would also be something where people might come to some agreement. And then there's just how people will play with words so that everybody can declare victory, and we just don't know what they'll come up with. Maybe Venetian blinds. But, yeah.
Okay, any other questions? Another hand? There's one down here, Janu.
Thanks. This question might be more directed to Cecilia. If the world were turned upside down and you were his Solicitor General, the President, he came up last week and said that he has a very powerful alternative to the current option, which is to reopen the government for these 3 weeks, being the national emergency. How would you argue that case? Or how would you even begin? I know you don't have case books right
How
in
to
front of you.
justify the declaration of a national emergency?
How would you even begin to do that?
Again, I think it depends on the details, right? There are statutes that various people have blogged about at Lawfare and other places that talk about the statutory methods that the president can use, statutory avenues the president can use to declare a national emergency. So presuming that he used one of those, I think they try to fit their arguments into that box. Again, I think it'll be very difficult given what he has said publicly about his threats to declare the emergency. Then again, we thought we had extremely good and voluminous evidence about his intent with the Muslim ban, and of course, ultimately, couldn't prevail on that.
But I think that's the concern. I think that the court doesn't really want to say that that the person at the top of the executive branch can't make certain judgments in certain emergency or national security situations. I mean, the courts want to give that deference. These cases are pushing that to the limit and really showing, maybe the court might want to do that because they're assuming certain range of function, and we saw in that case, the Muslim ban case, unfortunately, from my standpoint, the court said, well, we're just not going to look behind this. And so I think that is the playbook for the Solicitor General, and I don't think I'm giving them any special inside advice.
Yeah.
Can I just note one thing, that these national emergency declarations, these provisions in the law that allow for that, they were written, I think, intentionally to be a little bit broad, but they always assumed a rational actor in the executive branch, that they would not use it in very extreme situations. So here we have what appears to be a little bit of a situation that is not one that I think most would think is a national emergency. So what does that mean? People start to wonder, maybe we're going to have to rein in the law. And I think this is going to foster a conversation in this Congress, about whether those purposely broad powers, so that the possibility of a real emergency a president can act quickly and protect us when something terrible happens and we don't have time for the Congress to meet, or perhaps the Congress isn't there because of some national emergency. So that is going to limit that authority, and that ultimately, I think, makes us less safe.
And I think that,
I was just going to say, for the court, they can always just decide not to take the case.
right.
You know, I mean, they might feel a need depending on how it gets presented, but that is a way, like when they decided not to stay the asylum ruling, or maybe not to take the DACA case, it just gives them, they have that out. They don't have to take cases.
And I think a good question is, why hasn't he already declared a national emergency? You know, and I think the answer to that is a political one. It's partly that people in his inner circle are advising him not to because they're making the calculation that Orr is talking about, but also because I think they're making another calculation, which is, unlike the specific statutes that were issued in the Muslim ban cases, which are about barring entry of non-citizens into the United States, the declaration of a national emergency, you could imagine being applied in all kinds of ways by a Democratic president. And so I have to think that there's a political calculation, a practical calculation that is a partisan one, that is one that really is fundamentally about the separation of powers and the president versus Congress, that some wiser, cooler heads somehow in the administration have at least so far prevailed on.
It's a great note to conclude on. Thank you all for coming, and we'll continue the discussion in other forums. Really, thank you, Cecilia. Thank you, Nancy.
Thank you.
Thank you all.